Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. After they'd taken Lot, a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and Aner. All these were allied by treaty with Abram. When Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he mobilized his 318 trained men who had been born in his household and pursued the invaders as far as Dan. Then, during the night, Abram divided his forces against them and defeated them. He chased them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He retrieved all the stolen property. He also brought back his nephew Lot and his possessions, as well as the women and the rest of the people. So welcome to Hear God's Word podcast. Today, we just read Genesis 14:13 through 16, and we read the story, as you could see, of Abram and his nephew getting kidnapped, as we were reading in the last episode in verse 12. I started it out by kind of loosely quoting that verse when it says in 12, they also took Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions. So that was the backdrop of this story. And Abram is, as we can see, becoming a pretty affluent man. Now that he's split off with Lot, he still has a lot going for him possession-wise. He, even here we can see, made a treaty with the local Amorites. So when he was living in the Bethel area between there and Ai, it said in chapter 13, verse 7, that when he was in that area, he was in the land of the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But if you go back to the genealogy earlier, it says that the Amorites are Canaanites. They came from the Canaanites. So technically, he's still in the land of the Canaanites, but he's with specifically Amorites. And if we start in verse 13, it says that a fugitive or someone who escaped from the raid and being taken captive up north, which we can see because they were fighting down towards the bottom area, even below Sodom and Gomorrah, down below the Dead Sea. But now all of a sudden they're up in this area. Well, they get chased north by Abram and his men. And you think, it says that he took 318 trained men and he scared off literally probably one of the biggest world powers in the world at the time, Elam, Shinar, Elisar, and the Goyim. It's not 100% if all of those troops, their kings and their soldiers, were present at the time when Abram attacked. It's possible they'd already taken their stuff and a lot of them went off. But it's clear that Abram was able to track down the troops and find his brother Lot and even get back the possessions. So let's talk about a few things here. First off, a fugitive, someone who escaped, knew that Abram was the uncle of Lot. I'm sure that Lot had spoken with this person, was maybe friends, and so he knew who Abram was, and he knew where to find him because I'm sure Abram told Lot, or they even communicated or visited each other from time to time once they had moved and separated from each other. And so this guy who gets away from the troops of the Far East after they had invaded and taken captives, he went to tell Abram, and it says here, we have the very first time it uses the term Hebrew, but as we've mentioned before, essentially it just says that Abram was a person of the Eberites. If you wanted to translate it literally, if you kind of matched it with the other nations around, because it doesn't say Hebrews, it literally has the Eber people, or the Eber, and then it has a yod at the end, which makes it plural. And so essentially the people of Eber. And like we talked about, Eber was actually in the genealogy, so they could have picked any people to have named the people that came from his descendants after, but Eber is the main figure that was important for Abram's family line and all of the descendants that were coming from that line. They just decided to trace it back to Eber as their father. And so we have Abram the Hebrew, and as we said, if you want to have fun and call him the Eberite, you can. Technically, it's not wrong, but no one will probably understand you except for Bible nerds and scholars. And it says that Abram was living at the time, and it says specifically that the Oaks of Mamre is not just a location, but it said he lived by the Oaks of Mamre, the Amorite. So Mamre is just like we've talked about before, you name a place after a person a lot of times. For example, my old hometown is called Warrenville because it's named the village of Warren. So Warrenville Village. So you have a lot of names like that all over the world. Anywhere you go, you're going to have places named after people. And here, this area was named after Mamre, and it was called the Oaks of Mamre. But Mamre himself, who the place was named after, was an Amorite, and the Amorites were Canaanites. So the Amorites stemmed from Canaan, and it says that Mamre was the brother of Eshcol and Aner. And so you have three guys, and they're brothers, and of course, it seems they live in the same area. A lot of times, for example, my family grew up pretty close to each other within a good 20 miles or so any direction. Most of the family was pretty close together. And so this family is in that area of the Oaks of Mamre and Eshcol and Aner. It says that they had a covenant with Abram, and you may have read earlier, we actually called it a treaty. And you can see that in verse 13 where we're still talking about, but some versions call it an alliance. Most, strangely, don't call it what the technical, literal word is, which is a covenant. But that's the same thing, what it is, just as we've talked about how God and Abram had made an alliance, and Abram is faithful to God. That's his number one and primary alliance that he's made. So Abram has an alliance with God, but he can also make it with people. There's no law that God said, you can only ever know me, have an alliance with me, have a relationship with me, but you have to disown every other human. You can't interact with anyone. If so, I'm going to call you out. You're cheating on me as your God because you have other friends. I want to be your only friend. Like, God is obviously not like that. God gives Abram a blessing by allowing him to build good rapport with the people he's living around. And so he's making friends with the Amorites, the Canaanites, and he wouldn't be surviving if he didn't have friends around him, because obviously these were places where, especially back in those times, if you don't have people on your side and you're a small little tribe, you might be completely taken over, taken captive, annihilated. And Abram is doing pretty well for himself. He's built these connections, and it's clear that he made an alliance. And so there's lots of different translations that say different things. Some say that he was allied with them, that these people were Abram's allies. Most of them say that. Some say treaty. And then in the King James, it says these were confederate with Abram, which means that they had a confederation and a partnership together. And there is also a few other, like in the Christian Standard, it says they were bound by a treaty. And in just a couple other ones, in the contemporary English version, it says they were Abram's friends, which I don't think really properly communicates what's going on. But nonetheless, it is true. And that was one way that I described it already. He had made friends with them. But it obviously goes a step beyond that. They're protecting each other's back, and they possibly even signed a treaty stating their loyalty to each other. In the Douay-Rheims Bible, it says that for these had made league with Abram. So they, just like the Justice League for superheroes, they formed a league together. They have this alliance. And so you can get the picture that Abram had something helpful and good behind his back. And so when you're protected by the people around you, a lot of times it gives you more of a safety net. And so now that we have Abram and he's a hero, and this fugitive comes and shares with him, it says in verse 14 that when he heard what happened to his nephew, that he'd been taken captive, he mobilized 318 trained men. When it says this, it talks about how he specifically took armed and trained or experienced servants or men, because it says that he took people who were born in his house. So that could have been immediate family and his children, but a lot of them were the people of his house. And his house, when we talk about a house in Israelite and Hebrew tradition, we're not talking about people who were living in his tent or his little house, although he could have built a little more elaborate one for himself with all that he had resource-wise. But what it's saying is that everyone part of his tribe is his house. So everyone who had been born part of his tribe, he took, it says, 318 men. And it's possible that this number could be symbolic. I haven't found anything specific, because that's not really a lot of guys if you're chasing a powerful army. I mean, you better have like extremely amazing trained men who have such great specialties that one of them will equal a bunch of the enemy. However, it says that he went and pursued or chased or attacked the army of the four kings or the Far East, all the way up as far as Dan. And Dan was a region or city that was close to as far as you can get north in Israel without crossing over into Aram or Phoenicia, like that sort of area. It's kind of in that dead middle region. You could also say, current day Jordan sort of area. Basically, those middle, straight up the Jordan River and Valley sort of tribes. Dan was up there, and it says that he chased them all the way that far. And then it says he divided them up against the enemies. So he divides his 318 men up, and not exactly sure why, how, but it's possible that, like I said, the Far East armies probably had already branched out and were camping in different areas, and they were probably fleeing and going off in different directions. So Abram had to split his men so they could find the right group, because if they chase them and then the group with his nephew gets away, then what's the point? I mean, of course, yeah, you want to take down people who are intruding the relative area, but Abram lived far enough away to where, even though they could have easily just pivoted and shoehorned around the Dead Sea and came to attack that Hebron area or the Oaks of Mamre where he was living, they hadn't gotten that far west. But with that said, Abram was more so fighting to help out Lot, and he also, we'll see later, built some rapport with the Sodomites through this because he did them a favor and helped them out, and he probably freed more people than just his nephew. So it says he, attacked and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus, and Damascus is even more northeast than Dan. So there were some offshoot rivers and plains in that area. So the four kings are going off towards Damascus and they're getting chased down. They go even more north, which it says left, technically, if you take the Hebrew literally, because I learned that they don't use cardinal directions, just relative. But if they were going east and facing east and they went left, which direction would that be? That would be north. So they split off north when they were being chased east. And so now they had gotten as far as Hobah, which again is north of Damascus. And we know even today Damascus is found in Syria, which Syria is Aram. So we have them going up north into Aram even further, and probably heading towards the direction of where Abram originally came from in that Padan Aram, the area or land of Haran. So that's not really important because it doesn't say anything about that, but just giving you guys also a little bit of context, because maybe he actually was concerned that some of his old family and ancestors who are still living in Haran might get attacked if they keep going further north. So he wanted to especially cut them off before they got up there. Who knows if some of his other family could have been invaded by these kings. And so just throwing out my thoughts and just talking geography, and it's possible that that could have been going through Abram's mind as well, especially as he's moving up north, like, oh dang, I wonder if I still got family up there, and what if they reach that far north. Then again, it's possible that those could have already been part of the Goyim or part of these groups. But with that said, it continues on in verse 16, which is our last one. After they're chased up north, it says, he retrieved all the stolen property or goods or possessions, and he also brought back his nephew Lot and his possessions, as well as the women. So he got obviously a lot of people that he freed. I don't know if they just had taken women plus, a few people, men, hostages, or again, if Lot was a soldier, maybe they had some of the troops hostage. But he frees them, and it also literally right after it says the women, it says, and the rest of the people. So they obviously took a handful or quite a load of hostages. And it really says something about Abram and his people, because although that's something you never hope you have to do, Abram was a strong man and warrior, and he went after those who had kidnapped his nephew. And as an uncle, if your nephew is kidnapped, you would try to do something about it. That's his family. And Lot had lived with him up until semi-recently. And so, in a way, he's the only father, especially since Lot's father did pass away. He's the only father that Lot has. So he is Lot's dad, essentially. So when he went to go rescue him, that was something that I'm sure spoke volumes to Lot. And I'm sure that not only did Lot appreciate his uncle coming, but a lot of people saw the maturity and found respect in Abram and his action, and the fact that he got some of his men to take down a pretty powerful force. And so, whether or not he had a literal 318 men, again, I'm not 100%, but they did their job, and they were special forces in this scenario. So, did they spend some time prepping? Maybe just a pinch. He obviously coordinated it, but he also did it on the fly, because it says they divided up. And so Abram is a hero at this point. He's taken back what these Far East monsters of a threat and threatening monsters had taken from the people of the Death Valley, and especially seemingly more so the Sodomites, and also it seemed like those from the Gomorrah area as well. But we're going to finish off a really interesting, mysterious, and powerful story that deserves a whole focus of itself in the next episode. So I'll save the rest of the story for there, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.